The most widely quoted line from the Emerald Tablet is also the most incomplete. For 5,000 years, the same 7 words have traveled from hand to hand, from text to translation to quotation, as above, so below. While the 12 verses surrounding them were left behind, you've heard the phrase. You've seen it on walls and jewelry and social media captions. But the 7 words were extracted from a working system, and what surrounds them is not decoration. It is the mechanism. Tonight we are not looking at the quote. We are opening the document the quote was pulled from, and what is inside it changes everything you were told about the nature of reality. A text, 13 verses, a transmission chain spanning 4,000 years of continuous use, translated from Greek into Arabic, from Arabic into Latin, from Latin into the hands of minds who built the foundations of Western science. The blueprint was always there, complete, operational, pointing at the architecture of reality itself. Alchemists copied it by candlelight. Scholars argued over its translation. Initiates memorized it as working instruction. And when the tradition that housed it was dismantled, when the schools that preserved it were closed, their libraries burned, their teachers scattered, the text itself survived. 13 verses, intact, hidden inside the one phrase everyone quotes and no one finishes reading. Something deliberate happened to the transmission of this document. The institutions that controlled knowledge for the past several centuries made a calculation. One that may not have been conscious in every case, but whose effect was consistent across time. Isolate the poetry, discard the mechanics, take the beautiful phrase, embed it in culture, allow it to circulate as decoration. Let it become a tattoo, a mug, a wall print, and in doing so, neutralize it. A piece of knowledge stripped of its mechanism is not knowledge. It is aesthetics. It is a map with the landmarks removed. You are left holding the frame. The territory carefully was placed somewhere else. If this is the kind of knowledge you've been looking for, subscribe to this channel. This is where we decode what has been hidden in plain sight for centuries. And this is just the beginning of what we are uncovering together. Ask yourself this. Why would a 7-word phrase survive 5,000 years while the system it was extracted from nearly disappeared from the public record? Not because the 7 words are false, they are accurate, but because they are incomplete, they are safe to circulate. They produce wonder without action, awe without change. They do not give anyone the full map. They give everyone the sense that a map exists, which is enough to satisfy curiosity without activating it. The people who extracted those 7 words from their context understood something about information. Partial knowledge is more controllable than complete knowledge. Tonight, we are completing the map. In the 8th century, an Arab alchemist named Jabir ibn Hayyan, known in the Latin West as Geber, produced what is considered the earliest surviving Arabic version of the Emerald Tablet. Jabir was not a mystic poet, he was a working chemist, the man whose experimental methodology laid the foundations for what eventually became modern chemistry. He distilled substances, isolated compounds, documented procedures with precision that was centuries ahead of his contemporaries. And the text he selected to translate, preserve and build his work around was this one. Not because it was beautiful, because it was accurate, because when applied, it produced results. That is the first piece of information about the Emerald Tablet that is almost never included in the common narrative. The narrative handed down through mainstream academic channels is this. The Emerald Tablet is an esoteric document of uncertain origin, probably composed sometime in the early centuries of the Common Era, containing poetic metaphors drawn from Neoplatonic philosophy, with no practical application. Beautiful, symbolic, irrelevant to real knowledge. But the practitioners who kept it alive for 2,000 years were not interested in symbolism. Jabir ibn Hayyan used it as an operational framework for chemistry. Roger Bacon cited it in his Foundations of the Scientific Method. Isaac Newton translated it by hand. These are not credulous mystics. These are the architects of the empirical tradition itself. And they treated this document as a working manual. Right now, write in the comments. Begin with today's date and finish the sentence. I decoded what was hidden. Picture a monastery scriptorium in 12th century Europe. A monk is bent over a manuscript, copying a text translated from Arabic, which was itself translated from Greek, which was itself translated, possibly, from something older. He does not understand the full scope of what he is transcribing. The chemical language is obscure to him, the four-level cosmology unfamiliar, the procedure for ascending and descending through the levels of creation, unlike anything in his training. But he recognizes that it is important, that the people who possessed this text before him treated it with the kind of care reserved for operational knowledge rather than decorative knowledge. He copies it anyway. That act of copying is why you are reading this tonight. No original text survives. Let that land for a moment. No original, no stone tablet, no ancient papyrus, no primary source that can be dated to its first transmission. What exists are copies, Arabic texts from the 8th century, Latin manuscripts from the 12th, Renaissance translations, early modern printed editions, and a continuous chain of practitioners who treated those copies as live instruction rather than historical artifact. The fact that no original survives has been used for centuries to question the text's legitimacy. But here is what that argument misses. The framework it transmits has survived intact across all of those translations and copies. The architecture is consistent. The procedure is coherent. The mechanism works. Ask yourself why a document would survive multiple language jumps, from Greek to Arabic to Latin to vernacular European languages, across more than 1,000 years of civilizational upheaval, cultural discontinuity, and active persecution of the traditions that carried it. The reason is not literary quality. Texts with literary quality disappear all the time. The reason is utility. The people preserving this document were not archivists. They were practitioners. They were preserving it because it produced results when applied. Knowledge that produces results generates a preservation instinct in the people who have access to it. The Emerald Tablet kept being copied because the people copying it kept finding that it was accurate. The Emerald Tablet belongs to a body of texts known as the Hermetica, a collection of Greco-Egyptian writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, a figure who represents the synthesis of the Greek deity Hermes and the Egyptian deity Thoth. Both figures held the same function in their respective traditions: the keeper of hidden knowledge, the guide between levels of reality, the recorder of cosmic law. Whether Hermes Trismegistus was a historical individual, a mythological construct, or a composite of multiple teachers, the texts attributed to this figure form a coherent operational framework. They are not disconnected philosophical musings. They are a system, one that has been applied, tested, and validated by practitioners across millennia and across cultural boundaries. Isaac Newton's handwritten translation of the Emerald Tablet survives in the Keynes collection at King's College, Cambridge. It is not a casual note. It is a working document, annotated, cross-referenced, with evidence of multiple passes through the text. Newton spent, by scholarly consensus, significantly more of his private intellectual life on alchemical texts than on the mathematics and physics that made him famous. The Principia Mathematica, the work that defined classical physics, was the public face. The Hermetica was the private foundation. Newton did not believe that understanding the motion of planets and understanding the principles of conscious transformation were separate endeavors. He appears to have believed they were the same inquiry at different scales. The inversion is precise, and it matters. the man the modern world credits with establishing the mechanistic view of reality, a universe of objects governed by external forces, was privately convinced that consciousness and cosmos operate according to the same principles. The famous clockwork universe was the simplified version, the public transmission. What Newton was actually studying in private, the emerald tablet, the alchemical corpus, the relationship between mind and matter, was the full architecture. He had the complete map. History received the partial one. And when you understand that the father of modern physics had a different understanding of reality than the one he is credited with transmitting, something in the standard story starts to require examination. If you're finding value in what we're uncovering here, take a second to like this video. That feedback is what keeps this work going. Roger Bacon, Paracelsus, John Dee, Giordano Bruno. The names that built Western intellectual history from the 12th century through the Renaissance, each studied this text, each cited it, each treated it not as mystical allegory, but as a map of how reality actually operates. Bruno was burned at the stake in 1600, not for astronomy, as the simplified version of his story goes, but for a complex of ideas drawn precisely from the Hermetic tradition, including the position that the universe is a unified, living, intelligent system. The ideas in the Emerald Tablet were not considered harmless poetry by the institutions that persecuted the people who applied them. They were considered dangerous. The academic position that esoteric texts like the Emerald Tablet represent primitive philosophy that was superseded by rational empiricism contains a structural problem that is rarely examined. The practitioners who kept this text alive were not pre-rational thinkers replaced by rational ones. They were the people who built the rational tradition. Jabir ibn Hayyan's experimental chemistry, Roger Bacon's empirical method, Newton's mathematical physics. These intellectual frameworks did not replace Hermetic knowledge. They emerged from people who were using Hermetic knowledge as their operational foundation. The story that rationalism superseded esotericism misrepresents the actual intellectual history. Esotericism was the laboratory from which the rational tradition drew many of its core methods. So what did these minds see in 13 verses that 2 centuries of institutional academia have trained people to overlook? The answer requires reading the text as they read it, not as literature, not as metaphor, not as the religious artifact of a dead tradition, but as a precision document describing the structure of reality and the mechanism by which consciousness interacts with that structure. When you read it that way, and only when you read it that way, the text becomes what Jabir ibn Hayyan, Roger Bacon, and Isaac Newton all recognized: a complete operational manual for navigating reality at a level most people never access, because most people never find the full text. Read the first verse of the Emerald Tablet carefully. Before it says anything about the universe or consciousness or creation, it says this: I speak not fiction, but what is true and most certain. The author opens by establishing accuracy, by preempting skepticism, by declaring that what follows is not symbolic, not metaphorical, not a myth about cosmic forces dressed in human language. The author is saying this is a description of actual mechanics. You are holding an operational document. 5,000 years ago, whoever first transmitted this text understood that the person receiving it would approach it with doubt, and built the declaration of precision into the opening line. That is not the move of a poet. That is the move of an engineer. Verse 2 is where "as above, so below" lives, but the full verse extends in a direction the 7-word quote does not. That which is above is like that which is below, and that which is below is like that which is above, to accomplish the miracles of the one thing. The phrase everyone knows is the observation. The phrase no one quotes is the application. This structural correspondence between levels of reality exists for a purpose. It exists to accomplish something. The miracles of the one thing, transformation at the level of matter, catalyzed by operation at the level of consciousness, are the result of applying the correspondence deliberately, rather than living inside it without knowing the mechanism is there. Hugo of Santala's 12th century Latin translation introduced this verse to European scholars in a form they could work with. Within a century, it was being cited in philosophical, alchemical, and early scientific texts across the continent. The correspondence principle, as above, so below, became the foundational assumption of an entire research tradition. If the patterns governing the cosmos also govern the body, the psyche, the material world, then studying any one of these levels with sufficient precision reveals something about all the others. It is the assumption that makes science possible. The universe operates by consistent principles, and those principles can be discovered. The Emerald Tablet articulated this assumption 1,000 years before the scientific method had a name. If you've been working with these principles but feel like something is still missing, like there's a layer to this you haven't fully unlocked, I left something for you in the first pinned comment. It is for those who are ready to move beyond surface understanding. Verse 3 introduces the principle that every serious practitioner of the Hermetic tradition has treated as the load-bearing structure of the entire system. All things were from the One, not from many forces, not from competing deities, not from random processes, from one unified source, one generative field from which all differentiated reality emerges. This is not an unusual position in the history of thought. It is, in fact, the dominant position across the most enduring intellectual traditions: Vedantic non-dualism, Taoist cosmology, Neoplatonic philosophy, and, as of the 20th century, quantum field theory. The unified field from which all particles emerge as local excitations is the contemporary scientific description of exactly this verse. The language changed. The structure did not. The miracles of the one thing. Pause there. Not miracles. Plural events produced by separate forces acting on separate objects. The miracles. Plural results produced by the correct operation of a single unified system. The Emerald Tablet is built entirely on this premise. Reality is one thing operating at multiple levels, and the practitioner who understands how those levels relate to each other can produce outcomes that appear, from a one-level perspective, to be impossible. They are not impossible. They are the natural result of operating the full system rather than one layer of it. That is not mysticism. That is leverage. Specifically, the kind of leverage that institutions built on controlling access to knowledge cannot afford to have widely distributed. The response from rational empiricism to the claim that ancient traditions were mapping the same territory as modern physics is predictable. Coincidence, projection, retrofitting. Ancient peoples had no framework for quantum mechanics. Therefore, any resemblance is superficial, metaphorical at best, but this response contains a hidden assumption that physical description and operational description are the same thing. They are not. Physics describes the structure of reality in mathematical terms precise enough to make predictions. The Hermetic tradition described the structure of reality in operational terms precise enough to direct action. Two different languages, the same territory. And in the domain that matters most to a person living a life, how do I change the conditions of my existence? The operational map is the useful one. Verse 4 of the Emerald Tablet contains a description that has been read as mythology for centuries and operates as a precision architectural specification. Its father is the sun, its mother the moon. The wind carried it in its belly. Its nurse is the earth, 4 elements, 4 levels, fire, water, air, earth, but not as literal chemical substances. As levels of reality operating simultaneously, the generative principle, the receptive principle, the carrier frequency, the material anchor. And where is the practitioner in this architecture? At the intersection of all 4, not below them, looking up, not outside the system, observing it. Inside it, at the point where all 4 levels converge, the human being is not a passenger in the universe. The human being is a working instance of the universe's full architecture. Does this mean the ancients who transmitted the Emerald Tablet were describing quantum mechanics? Not in any technical sense. They had no access to the mathematical formalism that allows physicists to calculate particle behavior with precision. But quantum mechanics does not own the observation that reality operates according to layered correspondence. It simply arrived at that observation from a different direction, using a different instrument. The Hermetic tradition arrived at it through rigorous practice and careful observation of how consciousness interacts with matter over time. Modern physics arrived at it through mathematical modeling and experimental verification. The roots are different. The destination, a reality that is a unified, multi-level, coherent system, is the same. Verse 4 places the human being at the intersection of all 4 levels simultaneously. This is the position that the education system, without stating it explicitly, has spent 2 centuries training people to vacate. The mechanistic worldview assigns the human being a specific location, in the material level, subject to forces originating from outside. You are acted upon. You are a product of genetics, environment, circumstance. The Emerald Tablet's architecture assigns a different location. You are not the product of external forces. You are the point where the full 4-level architecture of reality is actively operating. What happens at the subtle levels cascades into the material. Your access to the subtle levels is the mechanism of transformation. Something shifts when you read it this way. Not as above, so below, as a beautiful phrase for a wall hanging. But the same structural principle that governs the movement of planets across centuries governs the movement of thought through your body in this exact moment. Not approximately, not symbolically, the same principle operating at different scales, and which is what the verse says. When that lands, the question that follows is not, is this true? The question is, if this has always been true and I have always been operating inside this system, why have I been working at one level while the other 3 ran without my direction? That question is the beginning of the practice. The education system that most people in the modern world went through taught a specific model of the universe: vast, external, mechanical, indifferent. You are a small consciousness inside a large impersonal system. The forces that shape your life originate outside you, in economics, in genetics, in historical circumstance, in the decisions of other people. You can work hard, you can optimize, you can adapt, but the source of the patterns is elsewhere. The Emerald Tablet offers the precise inversion of this model. The universe is a pattern, and you are a working instance of that pattern. The same forces, the same architecture. You are not contained inside the system, you are a running implementation of it. Verse 5 is where the tablet moves from description to procedure. Separate the earth from the fire, the subtle from the gross, gently and with great ingenuity. Not a metaphor about spiritual purification, a working instruction for a specific operation. The deliberate distinction between levels of reality that have been conflated. Most people move through life with their levels merged. Emotion experienced as physical sensation, thought experienced as external fact, material circumstance experienced as identity. The procedure in verse 5 says, separate them. Learn to identify which level is generating what, the earth from the fire, the dense pattern from the light one, gently, with precision, not through force, through clear seeing. The alchemical principle of solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate, separate and reunite, maps directly to verse 5. Medieval and Renaissance alchemists working with this principle in physical laboratories understood that the physical process was a mirror of a consciousness operation. The substances they dissolved and recombined were not only chemical. The laboratory was a working model of the psyche. The lead in their language was the dense, unexamined, reactive self, the self shaped entirely by external condition, operating from unconscious pattern. The gold was the refined, intentional, self-directed consciousness, the self that had completed the separation described in verse 5 and knew the difference between its levels. The laboratory was a methodology for producing a specific kind of mind. Centuries of narrative have calcified around the idea that alchemists were failed chemists, proto-scientists who believed you could literally turn base metals into gold, and who were superseded by real chemistry when people learned to work with actual substances rather than mystical ones. This narrative is demonstrably wrong in a way that the people who study the primary texts have known for decades. The serious alchemists, Jabir ibn Hayyan, Paracelsus, John Dee, were not confused about chemistry. They were running a parallel inquiry. The laboratory work was real. The chemical knowledge it produced was real. And simultaneously, the metallic language, lead, gold, transformation, purification, was a precise technical vocabulary for a consciousness process that had no other available terminology. Verse 6 is the part of the Emerald Tablet that describes the complete movement practitioners have been working with intuitively for centuries without the manual. It ascends from the earth to the heaven and descends again to the earth and receives the power of the superiors and of the inferiors. Picture the movement precisely. You begin in the material. You move your attention upward, through sensation, through emotion, through thought, through pure consciousness, gathering the clarity available at each level. Then you return, fully, into the body, into action, into material reality. But you return carrying what you gathered, and in that return, the material level reorganizes according to what you brought back. This is not visualization. This is verse 6. Why does this ascending and descending movement produce results that straight material level effort does not? Because the reorganization happens at the level where the pattern originates. You can rearrange the material expression of a pattern indefinitely without changing the pattern itself. The pattern will keep reproducing the same material conditions in different forms across different areas of your life until the level at which the pattern is being generated is addressed. The ascending movement of verse 6 takes your attention to the generative level. The descending movement brings precision back into material action. The result is not effort, it is alignment. Alignment produces outcomes that effort alone at the material level cannot reach. Ascend, gather, descend, anchor, not as 4 separate steps executed in sequence, as one unified movement, the way breathing is one movement in 2 phases, not 2 separate actions. The tablet does not describe a technique you perform occasionally. It describes the natural operation of consciousness when it is working with its full architecture, rather than a fraction of it. You are already doing a version of this every time you solve a problem, every time you create something, every time you navigate a situation that required more than mechanical response. The difference is whether the movement is happening by accident or by design. The tablet is the design document. You have done this by accident. There was a moment, and if you think back you will locate it, when you held something in your attention with complete clarity. Not hope, not wishful thinking, not the effortful visualization of a specific outcome. Clarity, a quality of knowing that felt different from belief. And then you watched it arrive in your life in a form you did not plan and could not have orchestrated from the material level alone. You may have called it luck, synchronicity, manifestation, Whatever you called it, the architecture underneath it was verse 6. The ascending movement gathered the clarity. The descending movement delivered it. The result appeared at the material level because the pattern had already changed. Law of attraction teaching, in its popular form, gives you one phase of the movement: ascend. Visualize, feel the emotion of having it, attract. This is the upward arc of verse 6. It is real. It is effective as far as it goes. What it omits is the descent, the equally precise return into material action, into the body, into specific, informed behavior that is now calibrated by what was gathered on the way up. Attraction without anchoring produces experiences that arrive and dissolve, breakthroughs that don't hold, clarity that fades. The tablet does not present these as separate techniques. It presents them as two phases of a single movement, and the movement is incomplete without both. Verse 7 is the axis of the document. So thou hast the glory of the whole world. Therefore let all obscurity flee from thee. The translation is archaic, but the meaning is precise. When you operate from the full architecture, when you can move through all four levels with intention and return with clarity, you have access to the full generative capacity of the unified system, and obscurity, the condition of not being able to see, dissolves, not as a mystical reward for correct practice, as a functional consequence. When you can see the full architecture, the places where you were previously unable to navigate become navigable. The full map replaces the partial one. Verses 8, 9, and 10 of the Emerald Tablet constitute what Hermetic practitioners called the description of the strong force. Not the nuclear force of modern physics, but the generative power of consciousness operating with precise intention from all four levels simultaneously. The sun, in verse 9, represents what the Kybalion would later formalize as the active, generative principle, the force that initiates. The moon, in verse 10, represents the receptive principle, the force that receives, organizes, and manifests. The Hermetic law of gender, the seventh principle in the Kybalion systematization, draws its architecture directly from these two verses. The masculine-feminine dynamic in Hermetic cosmology is not biological. It is a description of two complementary forces in a single generative system. Verse 8, verse 9, verse 10. The tablet is becoming increasingly specific and increasingly demanding. These verses do not describe a passive process of attraction. They describe an active process of co-generation. The practitioner is not waiting for the universe to deliver. The practitioner is operating with the universe as a partner in a generative process that requires conscious participation at all four levels simultaneously. By this means thou wilt partake of the honors of the whole world, not as a promise, as a consequence. Operate the full system with precision, and the full system responds with full generative capacity. The response is not supernatural. It is the natural behavior of a coherent system when its components are aligned. The interpretation of these verses as passive attraction, the idea that you hold a thought, feel a feeling, and the universe delivers the matching physical reality, misrepresents the tablet's architecture. Attraction describes what happens at the level of energetic correspondence. The tablet describes a four-level system with active and receptive phases, ascending and descending movements, precise operation at each level, and specific action in the material world as a required component of the process. The popular version removed the action. It kept the vision and the feeling, and it discarded the descent, which is precisely why so many people who work with these principles report results that are inconsistent, real sometimes, absent other times, dependent on conditions they cannot identify. What is the practical value of operating from all four levels simultaneously, rather than the one or two that most people access by default? Specificity. And specificity produces a quality of outcome that one-level operation cannot replicate. A person who can see the material level of a situation clearly knows what actions are available. A person who can also see the emotional level understands the forces that will resist or support those actions. A person who can also see the mental level identifies the assumptions generating the conditions they want to change. And a person who can access all three simultaneously, grounded in the physical, clear in the emotional, precise in the mental, produces results that appear from the outside to be disproportionate to the effort applied. Notice what has happened across these verses. The tablet has not asked you to believe anything. It has not required faith in a deity, subscription to a doctrine, or acceptance of any claim that cannot be tested. It has handed you a structural description of reality. Here is how the levels relate. Here is how movement between them operates. Here is what happens when the movement is complete, and left the verification to your own practice. This is not theology. This is operational instruction. The difference is material. Theology asks for belief and promises reward. Operational instruction describes a mechanism and invites you to test it. The Emerald Tablet has always been addressed to the person who tests. Verse 13, the closing of the manual, contains an inversion that most readers miss because they are looking for a conclusion and find instead a signature. Therefore am I called Hermes Trismegistus, having the three parts of the philosophy of the whole world. That which I have said of the operation of the sun is accomplished and ended. The author does not sign with a name. The author signs with a function, the holder of the three-part knowledge, heaven, earth, and the relationship between them. What was transmitted here was not the teaching of a specific individual. It was a function, a way of holding and working with the complete architecture, being passed from one practitioner to the next. The document ends as it began, with a declaration of precision. 13 verses, a complete system, hidden in plain sight, not in a vault, not in a restricted archive, but inside the most widely circulated quotation from the document. The line everyone knows. The 12 verses no one finished, available for centuries in multiple languages, published in mainstream history of science textbooks as a historical curiosity, cited in footnotes as an interesting artifact of pre-rational thought, and operating the entire time as a functional description of the architecture of reality, waiting for someone to read past the 7th word of the 2nd verse and keep going until the end. You have been told, by cultural repetition, by academic framing, by the implicit worldview embedded in standard education, that texts like this are mysterious, inaccessible, requiring specialized initiation to understand. The Emerald Tablet is neither mysterious nor inaccessible. It is precise. The language is archaic because it is old. The concepts are technical because they describe a technical process. But the structure it maps is the same structure you are already operating within, every day, with every thought, with every decision, with every attempt to change the conditions of your life. You have been living inside this system since before you knew a system existed. The tablet is not introducing something foreign. It is describing what has always been happening. The blueprint assembled verse by verse looks like this. Verse 1 establishes operating accuracy. Pay attention. This is real. Verses 2 and 3 describe the architecture, the unified field, the correspondence between levels. Verse 4 locates the practitioner within that architecture, at the convergence of all 4 levels simultaneously. Verse 5 gives the first procedure. Distinguish the levels. Separate what has been conflated. Verse 6 gives the core movement, ascend to gather, descend to anchor. Verse 7 describes the result of correct operation, obscurity dissolves, full access activates. Verses 8 through 12 describe the mechanics of the generative process in increasing detail. Verse 13 closes with the transmission itself. This was the complete 3-part philosophy of the whole world. Now you have it. What does this mean for a specific person sitting in 2026, not in a Renaissance laboratory or a medieval scriptorium? It means the variables have changed. The substance is your attention, your emotional state, your quality of intention. But the architecture of the procedure is identical. You do not need an alchemical laboratory. You do not need a mystery school initiation. You need precise self-observation, deliberate movement between levels of your own consciousness, and specific action in the material world that is informed by what you gathered on the way up. The process is available wherever you are. The tablet was not written for a specific context. It was written for the practitioner who shows up wherever and whenever they are ready. The Hermetic tradition identifies 3 primary levels of operation that every human being moves through, whether or not they are aware of doing so: the physical, the mental, and what the tradition calls the spiritual, the level at which pattern itself is generated rather than expressed. The Emerald Tablet describes how energy moves between these levels, and critically, how when you operate consciously at all 3 simultaneously, the results at the physical level become consistent rather than accidental. Consistent results are the signature of someone who has found the leverage point, the level at which the pattern generating their conditions can be altered. Accidental results are the signature of someone operating at one level while the other 2 run without direction. Think back to the last time you tried to change something in your life and the change did not hold. You took the right actions, you changed the behavior, you maintained the practice. And at some point, the old pattern re-emerged, in a new form, in a different area of life, but recognizably the same structure. This is what working at one level while the other 2 remain unchanged produces. The change at the material level is real, but the pattern generating the conditions you changed is still intact at the level above it. And a pattern that is intact at the generative level will keep producing matching material conditions until the generative level is directly addressed. The tablet is precise about this. Verse 5 is the instruction. The practical application for 2026 is the complete inversion of the approach most people were taught. Instead of beginning with action and hoping that action produces the right internal states, work from the top down. Begin at the level of pure clarity. Clear intention. What specifically is the condition you intend to create? Not a vague positive outcome, a specific pattern, aligned emotion, not manufactured feeling, but the genuine felt state that corresponds to that clarity. Then, and this is the phase most practitioners omit, descend fully. Take specific, informed, precise action in the material world, carrying everything you gathered on the way up, not as 3 separate steps executed in sequence, as one simultaneous movement that encompasses all 3 levels at once. Intention, emotion, action, simultaneous, not sequential. The reason most people work with these 3 elements sequentially, as a checklist, rather than simultaneously, as a unified operation, is that they learned them from traditions that had already separated them into distinct techniques. Visualization here, emotional clearing there, action planning elsewhere. The tablet describes them as a single undivided movement. And the reason the sequential approach produces inconsistent results is exactly this. At each moment of transition between steps, the integration breaks. The vision fades before the action begins. The emotion shifts between the visualization and the execution. The simultaneous movement does not have gaps. The 3 levels are held in alignment throughout. And the result anchors because the full system was engaged, not a part of it. Paracelsus, the 16th century physician who is considered one of the founders of modern toxicology and contributed foundational work to pharmacology, read the Emerald Tablet as a medical manual. His practical application of its architecture was direct, what he termed the above, in a medical context, referred to the condition of consciousness and emotion in the patient. What he termed the below referred to the condition of the physical body. His clinical practice was built on treating the body by addressing consciousness first, 5 centuries before psychosomatic medicine became a recognized field of study, and 4 centuries before neuroscience confirmed that the state of the nervous system governs the immune response, the inflammatory response, and the body's capacity for repair. The standard objection to applying ancient texts to contemporary life runs like this: the context is too different. The ancient world did not have antibiotics, internet, global finance, climate change, artificial intelligence. The frameworks designed for that world cannot map onto this one. The Emerald Tablet answers this objection structurally, not argumentatively. It does not describe a specific cultural practice. It does not prescribe behavior appropriate to a particular civilization. It describes the architecture of reality itself, the multi-level structure within which all human experience occurs, regardless of historical period, regardless of technological context, regardless of cultural framework. Architecture does not change by century. The same principles that govern reality in the 8th century govern it in 2026. How does someone begin applying this today, specifically, not theoretically? The tablet gives you the starting point in verse 1, accurate observation. Before attempting to change anything, establish what is actually present. Not what you wish were present, not what you fear is present, what is actually there at all 3 levels simultaneously. What is the physical reality of the situation? What is the emotional reality? Not what you think you should feel, but what is genuinely present in the body. And what is the pattern of thought generating both? Accurate observation of all 3 levels simultaneously is not a meditation technique. It is the prerequisite for working with the tablet's architecture. You cannot separate what you have not clearly seen. Picture 2 people facing the same difficult situation: a financial contraction, a relationship rupture, a health challenge. One of them can see the material level, the numbers, the behaviors, the physical symptoms. They know what actions are technically available. The other can also see the emotional level, the fear pattern embedded in the contraction, the unresolved grief driving the behavior, the anxiety accelerating the physical symptom. And additionally, they can see the mental architecture generating all of it, the assumption about their own value, the inherited belief about what is possible, the unconscious story about how things end. The second person has access to leverage points the first cannot see. The difference between them is not intelligence. It is the ability to read all 3 levels at once. You are here, reading this at this hour on this day, because something guided you to look for a more complete map. Not that the one you were given was false, partial. The actions you were taught to take are real actions. The effort you have applied has been real effort. But there has been a persistent sense that something was generating the conditions you've been working to change, and that your actions, applied at the level where the conditions appear, have been reaching it indirectly, when they reach it at all. The Emerald Tablet is the complete map, not a replacement for the partial one, an expansion of it. The partial map gets you to the territory. This one shows you where the leverage points are. No belief required. Let that be clear. Precision required. Observation, intention, execution. These 3, held simultaneously, applied at the level where the pattern is generated, constitute the complete practice the tablet describes. The text does not ask you to accept a theology. It does not require initiation into a tradition. It does not promise results contingent on faith. It describes a mechanism. The mechanism operates whether or not you believe in it, the same way gravity operates whether or not you believe in physics. The only requirement is precision. Vague intention produces vague results. Precise observation, precise intention, precise action. These are the inputs the system is designed to receive. Ancient knowledge was not suppressed because it was incorrect. Incorrect knowledge disappears without external help. It produces no results. Practitioners abandon it. The tradition dies from within. The Hermetic tradition survived 2,000 years of institutional opposition because it produced results when applied correctly. What was controlled was not the knowledge itself, which was always available for those who found it, but the context of its application. The mystery schools that transmitted this knowledge did not restrict it from cruelty. They restricted it because they understood that the tablet's architecture, applied without the full context, produces partial results, and that a practitioner who has produced a partial result believes they have encountered the limit of the system when they have only encountered the edge of their training. The current moment in 2026 carries a specific quality that multiple independent frameworks, Hermetic, astronomical, cultural, psychological, identify as a period of accelerated framework questioning. The shared pattern is this. The inherited explanatory systems that most people in the modern world absorbed without examination are becoming visible as systems, as constructions rather than facts, as maps rather than territory. And when a map becomes visible as a map, the first response is disorientation. The second response, for those who push through the disorientation, is the opportunity to choose a more complete map. Questioning your inherited framework is the first movement of the Emerald Tablet. The rest of the procedure follows naturally from that initial act of precise observation. You have been told that knowledge like this was reserved for initiates, for a small group of specially selected individuals who received this transmission within closed schools after years of preparation. The Emerald Tablet itself says nothing of the kind. The text does not contain a clause restricting its application to initiates. It does not identify a gatekeeping institution. It ends with its author stating that the operation is complete and being transmitted, not hidden, not restricted. Transmitted. The restriction that developed around this knowledge was added by those who understood what it meant. That a person operating from the full architecture of the Emerald Tablet has no structural need for external authority. They carry the complete map. They can navigate directly. The transmission chain that carried this document from its original context to the present did not break, despite every opportunity for collapse. Arabic manuscripts from the 8th century survived. Latin translations from the 12th century survived. Newton's handwritten annotations at Cambridge survived. Early printed editions survived. And in each era, the text found its way to the practitioners who were ready to work with it. Not always through institutional channels, not always through mainstream scholarship, but through the network of people who understood that this was operational material and treated it accordingly. The chain arrived intact, 13 verses, the complete architecture, the full movement described from beginning to end, and it arrived exactly here, to exactly this moment, on exactly this screen. You have the full text now, not the 7 words, the document, not the beautiful phrase extracted from its context and turned into decoration. The operating system the phrase was embedded in. 13 verses describing the architecture of reality, the location of the practitioner within it, the procedure for navigating it with precision, and the consequence of applying the procedure correctly. What you do with the difference between having the quote and having the text, that is where the practice begins. The quote can be admired, the text can be applied. Admiration produces wonder, application produces change, and change, specifically, the quality of change that comes from working at the level where the pattern is generated rather than the level where it appears. Something shifted in this video. You can feel whether that is accurate or not, and if it is, that feeling is itself information. Not the pleasant sensation of having heard interesting ideas. A different quality, the recognition of something you already knew but could not previously articulate. That recognition is not an accident of good explanation. It is a signal from the part of you that has always been operating inside this system, that has always been moving between levels, ascending and descending, generating conditions at the subtle level and anchoring them in the material. The part of you that has always been practicing verse 6. What changed tonight is not the system. What changed is that you have the document it was drawn from. Why did you find this tonight, at this specific time in your life? The question has an answer inside the text. The full verse 2, not the 7 words, but the complete verse, describes the correspondence between levels as a principle that includes timing. You received this when the level of understanding required for it to be useful was present, not earlier, when you would have found it interesting but not applicable, not later, when the window for applying it in the current conditions would have narrowed. Now, when the precise configuration of your readiness, your questioning, your current conditions, and the material being presented are in alignment. That is the tablet operating. That is what it means to receive the document rather than the quote. 2 paths are in front of you now. The first, take the full architecture. The 4 levels, the ascending and descending movement, the simultaneous operation of intention, emotion, and action, and bring it into your actual practice. Not as a belief system. As a working methodology, test it against your real conditions. Apply verse 5. Separate what you have been treating as merged. Apply verse 6. Ascend with precision, descend with action. See what changes. The second path, return to the 7 words. Beautiful, accurate as far as they go, safe to carry because they do not require anything of you. Both paths are available. One changes the operational conditions of your life. The other keeps them exactly as they are. The alchemists who copied and preserved the emerald tablet for 2,000 years were not doing it for posterity. They were not preserving a historical artifact. They understood that this document, in the hands of someone genuinely ready to work with it, is not ancient wisdom. It is current instruction. Its relevance does not decay with time because it describes the architecture of reality, and the architecture of reality does not change by era. A person in 12th century Europe working with verse 6 was running the same procedure as a person in 2026. Same structure, same movement, same consequence. The document was preserved not because it was beautiful, but because it worked. And because the practitioners who held it understood that eventually it would find the person ready to apply it fully. If you stayed until the end, write in the comments, I have the blueprint. I've placed another lesson on your screen right now, your next step on this path. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.